The night my father told me I had embarrassed this family for the last time. The temperature outside had dropped to 19 degrees, and I was 31 weeks pregnant. I remember the exact number because I had checked the weather app 3 minutes before I knocked on their door, sitting in my car in the driveway, giving myself one final pep talk. 19 degrees. I thought about going back. I thought about turning the key in the ignition and driving the 40 minutes back to my apartment, back to the pull-out couch I had been sleeping on since my husband died, back to the stack of overdue bills I kept face down on the kitchen counter so I wouldn't have to look at them before bed. But my OB had told me that morning that my blood pressure was dangerously high and that stress was the enemy, and I had nowhere else to go. So I got out of the car. My father opened the door before I could even knock. He must have seen my headlights pull in. He was holding a glass of bourbon and wearing the gray cardigan my mother had given him the Christmas before she passed, and the sight of it made my chest ache in a way I was not prepared for. "I told you not to come here tonight," he said. "I know. I'm sorry. I just need to talk to you about the contract. My name isn't on the licensing agreement and the deadline is Claire." His voice was flat, not angry. Flat, which was always worse. "We have people over." I could hear them inside. My brother's laugh, loud and performative the way it always was when he wanted someone to think he was charming. A woman's voice I didn't recognize. The smell of my father's pot roast drifting through the open door. The same recipe my mother used to make every Sunday. And something about that smell and that cardigan, and the cold pressing against the back of my neck, all hit me at once, and I felt my eyes burn. 5 minutes, I said. Please, just 5 minutes. He looked at me the way he used to look at homework I brought home that wasn't perfect. Like I was a problem he had already solved and didn't understand why I kept presenting myself as unsolved. "You made your choices, Claire. You married a man we told you wasn't stable. You put everything into that app instead of coming to work at the firm like I asked, and now you want to stand on my porch and ask me to fix it." He took a slow sip of his bourbon. "I'm done fixing your choices. Dad, the app is mine. I built it. My name needs to be on that contract or I lose everything. The company that's licensing it thinks it belongs to the firm." My brother told them, "Your brother runs the firm now. He runs it because you handed it to him after Mom died. The app has nothing to do with the firm. I built it on my own time, on my own. Go home, Claire. I don't have a home right now. You know that." For 1 second, just one, something moved across his face. Something that might have been the man I remembered from before my mother got sick. The man who used to drive me to robotics club at 6 in the morning and wait in the parking lot with terrible coffee and a crossword puzzle. But it passed so quickly I wasn't sure I had seen it at all. "Then figure it out," he said, and he closed the door. I stood there for a moment. I could still hear my brother laughing inside. I heard him say something about the licensing deal, and heard someone congratulate him. And I pressed my hand flat against the cold wood of the door and breathed through my nose the way my therapist had taught me, counting to 4 on the inhale, 4 on the hold, 4 on the exhale. Then I walked back to my car. The key wouldn't turn. I tried it twice, 3 times, and then I realized what I had been too distracted to notice when I pulled in. The check engine light I had been ignoring for 2 weeks had apparently made its final statement. The car was completely dead. I tried to call my roadside assistance, and that was when I discovered that my phone was also at 4% battery, which made sense because I had spent 3 hours in the waiting room at my OB's office without a charger. I called the roadside number and they told me the wait was 90 minutes minimum because of a weather event north of the city. I said that was fine. The woman on the phone asked if I was somewhere warm and I said yes because I didn't know what else to say. I went back to the porch because it had an overhang and the wind was coming from the north. I sat on the top step and pulled my coat over my stomach and I waited. My phone died at the 40-minute mark. I knocked on the door twice more after that. The second time, I could see through the narrow window beside the door that the dining room light was still on, and there were still people inside, but no one came. The third time I knocked hard enough that my knuckles ached, and my brother appeared in the window, looked directly at me, and walked away. I don't know how long I sat there after that, long enough for the cold to stop feeling like cold and start feeling like pressure. like something leaning against every inch of my skin. Long enough for my back to start spasming in a way that was different from the usual pregnancy ache, sharper, more insistent, long enough that when I finally heard a car door close somewhere at the end of the driveway, I didn't even turn to look. "Hey, are you okay?" A man. I turned. He was standing at the edge of the porch steps, hands in his coat pockets, looking at me with the particular caution people use when they're not sure if they're dealing with an emergency or something private. He was maybe 40, wearing a coat that looked expensive in the understated way that actually expensive things look, and he had a phone in his hand with the flashlight on, which was how I realized that the porch light had been turned off at some point without my noticing. "My car died," I said. My voice came out wrong. "Too thin. How long have you been out here?" "I don't know." "A while." I tried to stand up and my back seized and I made a sound I didn't intend to make. He was up the steps before I had fully processed that he was moving. He didn't touch me, just crouched down to my level, close enough that I could see his face clearly. He was looking at me the way people look when they are genuinely trying to assess whether a situation is serious. "I'm going to call an ambulance," he said. "No. Just need a minute. My roadside assistance is coming." "When?" I looked at my dead phone and didn't answer. He called 911 from his phone and stayed on the porch with me while we waited. He didn't ask me a lot of questions. He asked my name and my weeks along and whether the pain was constant or coming in waves. And then he took off his coat and put it around my shoulders over my own coat, without asking permission. And I was too cold and too tired to argue. I found out later that he had been driving past on his way home from a late meeting and had seen my car in the driveway with the hood ajar and pulled in to see if someone needed help. He had not known whose house it was. He told me this later, sitting in a plastic hospital chair beside my bed, while the monitors beeped their steady reassurances. And I remember thinking what an extraordinary thing it was to be saved by someone who was simply paying attention. They kept me overnight. Elevated blood pressure, mild preterm contractions that resolved with fluids and rest. Nothing that became the catastrophe it could have been. The nurse who checked my discharge paperwork the next morning patted my hand and said, "You need to stay away from whatever's stressing you out, honey." I laughed, which startled her. The man who had called the ambulance, his name was Daniel. I learned from the hospital staff who seemed to know him, which at the time I found mildly odd, had left his card on the table beside my bed, with a note in very neat handwriting that said, "Hope you and the baby are okay. Good luck with the car." I put the card in my coat pocket and didn't look at it again for 3 weeks. Those 3 weeks were the hardest of my life, which is saying something, because the previous year had included my husband dying in a construction accident in March and discovering in April that the app I had spent 4 years building, a project management platform specifically designed for independent contractors, because I had watched my husband's industry struggle with exactly that problem, had been registered under my father's firm by my brother, who had added himself as co-creator on the documentation, and told the licensing company that it had been developed using firm resources. My husband's name had been Patrick. We had been married for 2 years and together for 4 before that, and he was the first person who had ever looked at me presenting a technical prototype and said, genuinely, "This is going to change things for a lot of people." He died on a Tuesday in March on a work site in Cincinnati, and I found out by a phone call from a number I didn't recognize, and I drove to my father's house because I did not know where else to go. And my father made me tea, and did not speak for a long time, and in that silence I thought we understood each other. We did not understand each other. What I had interpreted as grief was, I think, calculation. Within 6 months, my brother had positioned himself as the primary contact for the licensing deal I had been negotiating for 2 years, had presented the app to a major infrastructure firm as a product of the family business, and had told me, when I confronted him, that I should be grateful he was managing it, because I was in no condition to manage anything. I had no money for a lawyer. I had Patrick's life insurance, which was less than it should have been because of a clause I hadn't read carefully enough, and I had the pull-out couch in a friend's apartment in Columbus, and a baby coming in 9 weeks, and I had nothing else. I looked at Daniel's card on a Wednesday night when I couldn't sleep. I looked up his name and I sat with my phone in my hands for a long time. Daniel Marsh. founder and CEO of Marsh Infrastructure Solutions, one of the largest construction technology firms in the Midwest. His company had pioneered the adoption of digital project management tools across large-scale construction, which meant he was, professionally speaking, exactly the kind of person who would immediately understand what my app did and why it mattered. I put the phone down. I picked it up again. I thought about my daughter. I knew by then that she was a girl. And about what I wanted her to understand about asking for help. About what it looked like to fight for something that belonged to you. I sent him an email. He responded in 11 minutes, which I would later learn was simply how Daniel operated with anything he found interesting. He said he would be in Columbus the following Thursday and asked if I was free for coffee. I wrote back and said I was, which was technically true in the sense that I had no money and no job and absolutely nothing but free time. But I chose not to clarify that in the email. We met at a coffee shop near the convention center where he had a conference. I had rehearsed what I was going to say. I had a folder with documentation, time-stamped development files, email correspondence, the original pitch deck I had shown Patrick in our kitchen the first time I walked him through the concept. I was 7.5 months pregnant, and I had done my hair and worn the one blazer that still fit me. And I arrived 8 minutes early and arranged the documents in a logical order and tried to breathe. Daniel walked in, saw me, and smiled the way someone smiles when they are actually glad to see the person they're meeting. He ordered coffee and sat across from me and said, "How are you feeling? How's the baby?" I had prepared for a business meeting. I had not prepared for someone to ask me how I was first. I said, "We're good. She's good. Thank you again for—" "You don't have to thank me," he said. "Tell me about the app." I told him everything. I showed him the files, walked him through the development timeline, explained the specific problem it was designed to solve. He asked very precise, very technical questions that told me he understood exactly what I was describing. He asked about the algorithm I had built for real-time resource allocation across multiple subcontractors. He asked about the integration capacity with existing payroll systems. He asked about the incident that had led me to start building it. And when I told him about Patrick, about watching the industry that had employed my husband operate with systems so fragmented that a man could fall through every crack, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "That's a real problem. You built a real solution." "I know," I said, "and my brother is about to license it to Hartwell & Associates under his name." Daniel looked at me steadily. "Tell me about the documentation." "My daughter was born 6 weeks later. Her name is Nora. She has Patrick's ears and my stubbornness, which her pediatrician considers a feature rather than a bug. She was born healthy and loud and entirely on her own schedule, arriving 4 days before her due date at 4 a.m. on a Sunday. And I cried in a way I had not cried since Patrick died. The kind of crying that isn't entirely sadness and isn't entirely joy, but is something that exists in the space where both things are true at once. My father did not come to the hospital. My brother sent a text that said congratulations with no punctuation. Daniel sent flowers with a note that said Nora is a great name. I had not told him I was naming her Nora. The legal process had been moving quietly in the background for 2 months by then. Daniel had connected me with an intellectual property attorney named Margaret, who had the energy of someone who had spent 30 years being underestimated and had made it her entire personality to correct that misperception in court. Margaret reviewed my documentation, interviewed me for 4 hours, and said at the end of our first meeting, "They were sloppy. That's going to help us enormously." They were sloppy because my brother had assumed I would not fight. He had assumed that a grieving widow who was pregnant and broke and dependent on family goodwill would accept whatever arrangement was presented to her because she had no other options. He had not been entirely wrong about my circumstances. He had been entirely wrong about my willingness to accept them. Nora was 6 weeks old when Margaret filed the initial claim. She was 8 weeks old when Hartwell & Associates, after reviewing the documentation our side submitted, quietly withdrew from the licensing agreement with my father's firm and requested a meeting with me directly. She was 10 weeks old when my brother called me for the first time in 4 months, and I let it go to voicemail. And his message was a masterwork of a person trying to sound reasonable while being genuinely panicked. I did not call him back. The industry event was my idea. Daniel had been invited to speak at the Midwest Construction Technology Summit, an annual conference attended by every significant player in the infrastructure sector, the kind of event that my father considered mandatory and attended every year in his best suit, the kind of event where deals were made and reputations were established. He asked if I wanted to come. I said yes. I asked Margaret to arrange for the licensing settlement documentation to be finalized and publicly filed 2 days before the event. I wore a green dress that Nora had spit up on twice that morning and which I had spot cleaned in the hotel bathroom. I left her with a babysitter who came recommended by Daniel's assistant and who sent me a photo every 45 minutes of Nora sleeping peacefully in a way that seemed designed to mock my anxiety. I walked into that conference center and I found a seat in the 3rd row and I waited. My father saw me before the opening session. He was standing with a group of men near the registration tables, doing the practiced networking handshake, and he turned and looked directly at me and went very still. I smiled at him. It was not a warm smile, but it was not an unkind one either. It was simply the smile of someone who knows exactly where they are and exactly why. My brother found me at the coffee station during the first break. He had clearly been watching for me. He walked over with the particular casual aggression of someone who has decided that the best defense is a confident offense, and he said, "Claire, I didn't know you were coming." "I know," I said. "We should talk. There's been some miscommunication about the documentation, and I think if we just—" "I don't think there's been any miscommunication," I said. "I think you knew exactly what you were doing. I think you've known since April of last year." His jaw tightened. "You're being irrational. You're still dealing with Patrick and the hormones from the baby and—" "Her name is Nora," I said. "And the settlement agreement was filed with the county clerk 2 days ago. The licensing contract is in my name. Hartwell and Associates is my client now." I picked up my coffee. Enjoy the conference. Daniel's keynote was the last session of the day. He spoke about the future of construction technology, about the specific gaps in existing systems that were costing the industry billions annually, and about a new platform that was going into full deployment with 3 major infrastructure firms in the first quarter of the following year. He showed a slide with the platform's interface. He said the developer's name. He said my name. He said that the tool had been built by someone who understood the human cost of the problem it was solving, and that understanding was the reason it worked. I was sitting in the 3rd row and I was wearing a dress that smelled faintly of spit up, and I felt something in my chest unknot that I had not realized had been knotted for a very long time. Afterward, my father found me in the lobby. The crowd was thinning out, people gathering their bags and exchanging final cards, and he crossed the room with the deliberate walk of a man who has made a decision. I watched him come. I did not move toward him. "You could have come to me," he said. "Before all of this, you could have talked to me directly instead of going around the family." "I tried to talk to you," I said. "I came to your house. You closed the door." Something moved in his face. The cardigan wasn't there this time, and somehow without it he looked older, more ordinary, less like the fixed point around which my childhood had orbited. I didn't know it had gotten that serious. "With the car and you knew I was sitting on your porch. You turned off the light." He was quiet. "I needed you to be my father," I said. "And you chose not to be. That was your choice, and it was serious enough to matter. Everything that happened after is a consequence of that choice." "Claire, I'm not angry at you," I said. And I realized as I said it that it was true. That somewhere between Nora arriving in the world and Daniel standing at a podium saying my name, the hot wire of anger had cooled into something else, something more like clarity. "I genuinely hope things go well for you. But I don't think we should be in each other's lives right now. Maybe not for a long time." He started to say something else. I didn't stay to hear it. Daniel was waiting by the exit with 2 cups of coffee and his car keys and the particular expression of someone who is ready to leave if you are, or stay if you need to, and is entirely comfortable with either option. I had come to understand in the months since that freezing porch that this was simply how he moved through the world, with a kind of patient attention that I had spent my whole life not knowing I was waiting to encounter. How'd it go? He said. About how I expected. I took one of the coffees. Is this decaf? Obviously. I thought about Patrick. I thought about how he would have wanted to see this, how he would have been insufferably proud in that quiet, genuine way of his, how he would have driven Nora to robotics club someday and waited in the parking lot with terrible coffee and a crossword puzzle, and thought that was an entirely reasonable way to spend a Saturday morning. I thought about my mother in that cardigan. I thought about the girl I had been, doodling and meeting margins and programming in the hours after everyone else went to sleep, building something real while the people around me built their version of what I was supposed to be. I'm starving, I said. Can we go get actual food? There's a place 2 blocks over, he said. Nora's going to be fine for another hour. I just got a photo. Of course you did. We walked out into the cold together, and behind me the lobby lights were bright and the voices of people I used to need to impress were fading. And the air outside was sharp and clean and entirely mine. My father called once more, about a month later. I looked at his name on the screen for a long time. I thought about everything I could say, all the versions of that conversation, all the ways it might go, all the exhausting negotiations of love and grievance and history that would be required to find any kind of solid ground. I let it ring. Some doors close from the outside and some close from the inside, and knowing the difference is the whole thing. That night on the porch, in the dark and the cold, I had thought he was closing a door on me. What I understand now is that I was the one who finally closed it, just quietly, from where I stood, without needing anyone on the other side to see me do it. Nora is asleep in the next room right now. She has my mother's forehead, I've decided. She smiles in her sleep the way Patrick used to. This private half-smile like she's having a conversation with something just outside my peripheral vision. She is 8 months old, and she has never once in her life been left in the cold. I'm going to make sure it stays that way.